Hi everyone. We're going to spend some time today talking about sociological research methods and designs, or probably more accurately, designs and methods, since you select a design before your method. But nonetheless, we're going to talk about some of the basics here first, and then we're going to expand our discussion of how science and sociology fit together. One of the things that I realized when I took my first sociology course was that I really liked sociology, but we didn't spend a lot of time on the science of sociology. And that, for me, really was a shortcoming of that introductory sociology course because I didn't really get a good grasp on the role of a sociologist as a scientist, a person who investigates the reality of what it means to be living together with other people, living in a community, a society, a nation. All right, so let's get started. So we're going to go over some of the preliminary steps that you would take to do a research project as a sociologist. And we're going to cover in this lecture the concepts of conceptualizing, the research question, the literature review, and operationalizing. And alongside those basic concepts, we're also going to talk about the differences between the scientific process and the interpretive framework. So the very first thing you have to do if you decide you want to do a research project as a sociologist is you have to conceptualize your research. And this really is just the idea that you have to spend a considerable amount of time up front prior to designing a project or selecting your methods and techniques. You have to know whether or not the concept that you want to measure can actually be measured. And that sounds simple on the surface, but really it's a very complicated notion, this thing of conceptualizing, because what you really want to do when you conceptualize is make sure that you iron out all of the potential pitfalls and problems that you might have if you proceed with a project. So it's about whether or not you can measure the concept, can you select the right variables, whether or not you can find people who would want to participate, are they available and will they freely participate, whether or not you can apply the right research ethics to your project and make sure that you don't violate the rights of your participants. So there are a lot of things that you have to really bear in mind when you're conceptualizing, and this can take a long, long time. And if we do a good job at conceptualizing, then we know whether or not we can actually proceed with the project, whether or not the project will be relevant, and whether or not we have anything to add to the body of research about a particular concept or phenomena. So once you've finished the process of conceptualizing and you decide, yes, I can proceed, you'll write your research question. Now, this is the first formal step of the scientific process or the interpretive framework, and it provides the largest container of your project. The research question does help us to bring into focus the scope of a project, and it can proceed in two different ways. The research question is either going to provide the scope of measurement for your project, your independent and dependent variable, or it's going to provide the scope of discussion in a project. Now, here's where things differ in the field of sociology or research with human subjects just in general from some other kinds of sciences. We have two different processes that we follow in the field of sociology when we do research. One of those is the one that's familiar to you already, the scientific process, and the other is the interpretive framework. And depending on how we proceed with a project is whether or not we're going to decide to use the scientific process or the interpretive framework. And again, that decision comes from being able to fully conceptualize a project before we start. These two methods are used for different reasons. If we're trying to test a hypothesis, we're definitely going to use the scientific process. But if we simply want to expose a social phenomena and try to understand it more deeply and meaningfully, and to design or develop new theoretical understandings of something, then we're going to use the interpretive framework. So let's take a little bit of a close look at these two things. All right, so as I said, if we want to measure something, we're going to use the scientific process. If we want to theorize about something, we're going to use the interpretive framework. You're all, of course, very familiar with the scientific process. The scientific process happens linearly, meaning that I start here and I end here, and that's always going to be the path I follow. And I have certain steps that I have to satisfy to continue the project. And if at any time during those steps I find that I've made a mistake, I have to start over. I may end up, for example, crafting a hypothesis, selecting some variables, and gathering data, and then finding out that the data is not answering the research question. And so I might have to go back, start over, and select a new hypothesis and get new variables and do a new measurement to see if I can get closer to answering my research question. So the scientific process is always about testing a hypothesis. It's always about selecting variables, collecting data, and deciding whether or not I was able to answer the research question that I set out to answer. The interpretive framework is very different than the scientific process, and it uses what we might call a spiraling approach, meaning that we can move through our project without having to completely abandon and start over if we find a problem. So with the interpretive framework, you're not trying to test a hypothesis. You don't design a research question with independent and dependent variables necessarily, and you don't collect data in the sense that you're looking to test a hypothesis. This is the kind of research that sociologists do, where they're trying to really much more meaningfully and deeply understand a social phenomena. So we might, for example, do a project using the interpretive framework to expand our knowledge about a topic, but not necessarily to say that a causal relationship exists or that there's a correlation among variables. And so the difference between the interpretive framework and the scientific process is vast. We tend to use the scientific process so that we can measure something, and we tend to use the interpretive framework so that we can understand something. Now, as you're conceptualizing your project, you're going to know whether or not you need to be using the scientific process or the interpretive framework. As a new sociologist, you might want to rely on other sociologists who've done research in the area that you're interested in to try and help you frame out which one of these different scientific methods would be the best for your project. All right, so regardless of whether or not we decide to use the scientific process or the interpretive framework, we're going to have to do a literature review. And really, I feel like the literature review is the most important step of any research project. We, as scientists, we want to avoid costly errors in how we're trying to describe something. We want to avoid unnecessary duplication of somebody else's research project. And we want to learn as much as we possibly can about the topic that we want to study so that we can understand how it's already been discussed and talked about by others, and also how they describe the concepts of our research, the mechanics, the nuts and bolts. So in my estimation, I think this is probably the most important and perhaps the most boring step of a research project. I enjoy it because I enjoy reading, but a lot of people do tend to brush off the significance of a literature review. It should take time. This step should take you a significant amount of effort and time, and you're going to have to, in your own research project, describe the work of other scholars. So you want to be very careful that you don't make mistakes by rushing through somebody else's research and perhaps only superficially understanding it or misinterpreting it. You want to make sure that you fully understand what other people have already said, so that when it comes time for you to take your measurements, you can compare and contrast what's already been said and measured, and you can make important advances on the body of research that already exists. All right, and the final piece of our discussion today is going to be about the concept of operationalizing. So at this point, we've already conceptualized. We have a good idea of what our research question is going to be, which leads us to whether or not we're going to use the scientific process or the interpretive framework for our project. Now we want to operationalize, and this is where you get to the specifics of a project, the nuts and bolts. What design have you selected? What method are you going to use? Are there any techniques that can help you collect your data? Clarifying variables might be important in this step if you're going to use the scientific process in particular. If you're going to use the interpretive framework, what's the theoretical orientation of the discussion that you want to have in your research? Here you're going to lay out a timetable. This is how long I expect the research will take. This is where I'm going to find my participants. And really, you're going to address here any other specifics of the project that you feel are essential for your reader to understand about the project that you are doing. So this is where you start to apply the technical aspects of the project itself. Because you've done a good job of conceptualizing already, operationalizing shouldn't be that challenging. You should be able to pretty easily and efficiently lay out how you're actually going to conduct your study. All right, so that's the first part of our lecture on research designs and methods. I hope this helps. Take care. Bye-bye.